The sun never set on an empire built on tea, opium, and the audacity of a small island nation that convinced the world it deserved to rule a quarter of humanity. It started with pirates, not the romantic kind with eye patches and parrots, but ruthless sea captains who sailed under royal permission to steal from Spanish treasure ships. Queen Elizabeth I called them privateers. The Spanish called them thieves. History would call them the foundation of the largest empire the world has ever known. Francis Drake circled the globe in 1580, his ship heavy with stolen Spanish gold. When he returned to England, the Queen didn't arrest him. She knighted him. This single moment revealed something crucial about the English character that would shape the next 4 centuries. They weren't just willing to break the rules. They were willing to rewrite them entirely. But here's what most people don't know about the British Empire. It wasn't planned. There was no grand strategy, no master blueprint drawn up in some London palace. The British Empire happened almost by accident, one desperate gamble at a time. And that's exactly what made it so dangerous. The East India Company started as a group of London merchants who wanted cheaper spices. They had no idea they were about to conquer India. When they got their royal charter in 1600, their biggest worry was competing with Dutch traders, not ruling 300 million people. They just wanted to cut out the middlemen and buy pepper directly from the source. The first English settlement in America began with a lie. The Virginia Company promised investors they'd find gold in the New World, just like the Spanish had found in Mexico and Peru. Instead, they found mosquitoes, disease, and hostile natives. Of the original 104 colonists who landed at Jamestown in 1607, only 38 survived the first winter. The rest died of starvation, disease, or arrows. John Smith, the colony's leader, had a simple rule that saved them all. He who does not work does not eat. It wasn't noble, it wasn't inspiring, but it worked, and this brutal pragmatism would become the empire's signature trait. The British didn't conquer the world through superior morality or divine right. They conquered it through superior stubbornness. The real breakthrough came when John Rolfe figured out how to grow tobacco in Virginia soil. Suddenly, the failed colony became a gold mine. Tobacco was so valuable that colonists grew it in the streets of Jamestown. They grew it in the marketplace. They even grew it in the cemetery. One plant changed everything. But tobacco needed workers. Lots of workers. And this is where the empire's darkest chapter begins. The first African slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619, just 12 years after Jamestown was founded. 20 people, sold by Dutch traders to English colonists who needed hands to work their tobacco fields. Those 20 people became 4 million by the time slavery ended in America. The British didn't invent slavery, but they perfected it. They turned human misery into an industrial process. Here's the twisted logic that drove the empire forward. Every problem became an opportunity. No workers, import slaves, natives fighting back, take their land, other Europeans competing for trade, start a war. The British turned crisis into conquest so consistently that their enemies started to think they planned it that way. The empire's first real test came in 1756, when it faced France in what Americans call the French and Indian War. Britain was fighting on 4 continents simultaneously. In North America, young George Washington was learning how to lose battles against French forces. In India, Robert Clive was about to pull off one of history's greatest military upsets. In Europe, Frederick the Great was bleeding Prussia white, fighting the French and Austrian armies. And in the Caribbean, British and French fleets were blasting each other to pieces over sugar islands. Most empires would have collapsed under this pressure. Britain thrived on it. But the real secret of British success wasn't their navy, or their armies, or even their ruthless pragmatism. It was something far more subtle and far more powerful. The British discovered that you don't need to occupy a country to control it. You just need to control its money. While other empires sent armies to conquer territory, Britain sent banks to conquer economies. They didn't want to rule the world. They wanted to own it. The East India Company proved this strategy worked. By 1750, they controlled more territory than most European kingdoms, but they did it with fewer than 3,000 British soldiers. How? They hired local armies, played rival princes against each other, and made themselves indispensable to the existing power structure. They didn't destroy the old system. They bought it. Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 shows exactly how this worked. Clive had 3,000 men facing a Bengali army of 50,000. On paper, he should have been massacred. Instead, he won without fighting. He'd already bribed half the Bengali commanders to switch sides. The battle was over before it began. This victory gave the East India Company control of Bengal, the richest province in India. Suddenly, a trading company owned territory larger than Britain itself. The profits were staggering. Bengal's tax revenue alone was worth more than the entire British government's annual budget. But success created new problems. The company's employees were getting rich beyond imagination, and London wanted its share. The British government started asking uncomfortable questions. How could a private company control more wealth and territory than the Crown itself? Who was really running this empire? The answer came in 1773 when Parliament passed the Tea Act, giving the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America. It seemed like a simple business decision. The company needed money, Americans loved tea, and Britain needed tax revenue. What could go wrong? Everything. American colonists saw the Tea Act as the final proof that Britain viewed them as nothing more than a source of profit. They weren't citizens of an empire. They were customers of a corporation, and when that corporation raised prices, they had no choice but to pay. The Boston Tea Party wasn't really about tea. It was about power. Who had the right to tax Americans? Who had the right to control their trade? Who had the right to make decisions about their future? The British government thought these questions had obvious answers. The Americans disagreed. Here's where the empire's greatest strength became its fatal weakness. The same pragmatic flexibility that built the empire made it impossible to hold together. The British were willing to compromise on anything except control. They'd negotiate on taxes, trade, and even representation in Parliament, but they would never negotiate on who was in charge. This inflexibility turned a tax dispute into a revolution. When the American colonies declared independence in 1776, they weren't just rejecting British rule, they were rejecting the entire imperial system. They were saying that people had the right to govern themselves, regardless of what some distant parliament decided. The British fought the American Revolution the same way they'd fought every other war. They hired foreign mercenaries, allied with local enemies of their opponents, and tried to turn the conflict into a profitable enterprise. They treated the American Revolution like a business problem that could be solved with the right combination of force and negotiation. They were wrong. George Washington understood something the British didn't. He didn't need to win battles, he just needed to avoid losing the war. Every month the conflict continued, it cost Britain more money and political support. Every British victory that failed to end the rebellion proved that the rebellion couldn't be ended. The surrender at Yorktown in 1781 wasn't just a military defeat. It was proof that the imperial system had fundamental flaws. If Britain couldn't hold on to colonies populated by their own people, speaking their own language and sharing their own culture, how could they hold on to an empire spanning the globe? But instead of learning from this failure, Britain doubled down on the empire. They'd lost America, but they still had India, Canada, Australia, and dozens of strategic islands around the world. The empire was wounded, not dead. The Napoleonic Wars proved this point. While continental Europe tore itself apart fighting French armies, Britain used its naval supremacy to expand its empire. They seized Dutch colonies when Holland allied with France. They took Spanish territories when Spain became a French puppet. They even grabbed French islands in the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean. By 1815, when Napoleon was finally defeated, Britain controlled more territory than ever before. They'd turned a global war into a global expansion. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, British merchants dominated international trade, and the East India Company was well on its way to conquering all of India. But the empire's next chapter would be written not in blood and conquest, but in steam and steel. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Suddenly, Britain could produce goods faster and cheaper than anyone else in the world. Their factories needed raw materials, and their workers needed markets. The empire provided both. Cotton from America and India fed British textile mills. Sugar from the Caribbean sweetened British tea. Timber from Canada built British ships, and British manufactured goods flowed back to every corner of the empire, creating a closed economic system that made Britain rich and kept its colonies dependent. This wasn't accidental. British policy deliberately prevented colonial manufacturing. India had been the world's largest textile producer for centuries, but British tariffs and regulations destroyed Indian industry to protect British factories. Raw materials flowed to Britain, finished goods flowed back to the colonies, and the profits stayed in London. The system worked so well that other European powers tried to copy it, but they were too late. Britain had a 50-year head start in industrial development and a global network of colonies, naval bases, and trading posts that no rival could match. The abolition of slavery in 1833 shows how the empire adapted to changing circumstances. Slavery had become economically inefficient compared to wage labor, and morally indefensible in an age of democratic ideals. So Britain didn't just end slavery in its own territories. It used the Royal Navy to suppress the international slave trade, turning moral leadership into political advantage. This campaign against slavery gave Britain the moral authority to intervene anywhere in the world where slavery still existed. It was humanitarian imperialism. Britain could invade, occupy, and annex territory while claiming to be liberating oppressed peoples. The strategy worked perfectly in India, where the East India Company used the campaign against sati, the practice of widow burning, to justify expanding British control over Indian society. They weren't conquering India, they were civilizing it. But this moral imperialism created a problem the British never anticipated. If the empire existed to spread civilization and Christian values, what happened when the colonized peoples became civilized Christians? Did they get to govern themselves? Did they get equal rights? Did they get to be British? The Indian Rebellion of 1857 forced Britain to confront these questions. The rebellion started when Indian soldiers in the British Army refused to use rifle cartridges greased with cow and pig fat, which violated both Hindu and Muslim religious beliefs. But it quickly became something much larger. For the first time since the conquest began, Hindus and Muslims united against British rule. Princes who had been loyal to the East India Company joined the rebellion. Even some British-trained Indian officers switched sides. The rebellion spread across northern India like wildfire. The British response was savage. They executed rebels by tying them to cannons and blowing them apart. They burned entire villages suspected of supporting the rebellion. They killed thousands of civilians in reprisal attacks. The message was clear. This is what happens when you challenge British rule. But the rebellion changed everything. The British government dissolved the East India Company and took direct control of India. The age of corporate empire was over. From now on, The British Empire would be run by the British government, not by private companies seeking profit. This change created new problems. Government-run empires needed to justify their existence to voters back home. Corporate empires only needed to show profit, but democratic empires needed to show moral purpose. The solution was the civilizing mission. Britain wasn't conquering the world for profit. It was spreading civilization, Christianity, and good government to backward peoples who couldn't govern themselves. The empire became a moral crusade. This ideology reached its peak during the reign of Queen Victoria. The British convinced themselves that they were the chosen people, destined to rule the world for its own good. They built railways in India, schools in Africa, and hospitals in the Caribbean. They suppressed local customs they considered barbaric and imposed British law, British education, and British values. The problem was that some of the colonized peoples actually believed this propaganda. Educated Indians, Africans, and others took British claims about civilization and democracy seriously. If the British were really spreading enlightenment and good government, why couldn't Indians govern India? Why couldn't Africans govern Africa? Why did civilization always require British control? These questions became more urgent as the empire expanded in the late 19th century. The scramble for Africa saw European powers carve up an entire continent in less than 20 years. Britain grabbed the largest share, adding Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and South Africa to an empire that already spanned the globe. But this expansion was different from earlier conquests. The British weren't just taking territory. They were taking responsibility for millions of people who had never asked to be British subjects. The empire was becoming too big to manage and too expensive to maintain. The Boer War from 1899 to 1902 revealed these problems. Britain needed 450,000 soldiers to defeat 80,000 Boer farmers in South Africa. The war cost more than the entire British government budget for a year, and the methods Britain used to win, including concentration camps that killed thousands of Boer civilians, damaged Britain's moral reputation around the world. Even victory felt like defeat. Britain won the war, but lost the peace. The Boers eventually regained political control of South Africa and used it to create the apartheid system. Britain had spent a fortune and sacrificed its moral authority to create a racist state that would embarrass the empire for the next century. World War I finished what the Boer War started. The empire survived the war, but just barely. Britain borrowed massive amounts of money from the United States to pay for the war effort. The Royal Navy, which had ruled the seas for a century, was now smaller than the American fleet, and the war had awakened nationalist movements across the empire. Ireland was the first to break away. The Easter Rising of 1916 failed, but it inspired a guerrilla war that Britain couldn't win. In 1922, Ireland became independent, except for 6 northern counties that remained part of the United Kingdom. The empire had lost its oldest colony, but the real threat to the empire wasn't military. It was ideological. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, announced in 1918, included the principle of self-determination. All peoples had the right to choose their own government. This idea was dynamite to an empire built on the assumption that some peoples were fit to rule and others were fit to be ruled. The British tried to adapt by creating the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of self-governing dominions that remained loyal to the British Crown. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa became independent in everything but name, while remaining part of the imperial system. This solution worked for white-majority dominions. But what about India? What about the African colonies? What about the Caribbean islands? Were they ready for self-government? Would they ever be ready? And who got to decide? Mahatma Gandhi provided the answer. Through non-violent resistance, he proved that the British Empire depended on the consent of the governed. If enough people refused to cooperate with imperial rule, the empire couldn't function. Gandhi's genius was turning British values against British rule. He used Christian concepts of love and forgiveness, democratic ideals of equality and justice, and liberal principles of individual rights to argue that British rule in India was immoral by Britain's own standards. The Salt March of 1930 showed how this worked. Gandhi walked 240 miles to the sea to make salt in violation of British law. It was a simple act of civil disobedience, but it exposed the absurdity of imperial rule. Why should Indians pay taxes to Britain for the right to make salt from their own seawater? Thousands joined the march. Millions more followed Gandhi's example across India. The British arrested 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself. But every arrest proved Gandhi's point. The empire could only survive through force, and force was incompatible with the democratic values Britain claimed to represent. World War II accelerated the empire's decline. Britain fought the war to defend democracy and freedom, but how could it deny democracy and freedom to its own colonies? The contradiction became impossible to ignore. The war also bankrupted Britain. By 1945, Britain owed more money than it could ever repay. The empire had become a financial burden rather than a source of wealth. Maintaining colonies cost more than they produce in revenue. The end came faster than anyone expected. India gained independence in 1947 and was partitioned into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The partition created one of the largest refugee crises in human history, as millions of Hindus and Muslims fled across the new borders. Hundreds of thousands died in communal violence. But independence was irreversible. If Britain couldn't hold on to India, the jewel in the crown, it couldn't hold on to anything. The psychological foundation of the empire collapsed. Over the next 2 decades, colony after colony gained independence. Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963, and dozens of others. By 1970, the British Empire had shrunk to a handful of small islands and territories. The Suez Crisis of 1956 marked the empire's final humiliation. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France invaded to retake it. The United States forced them to withdraw, proving that Britain was no longer a great power capable of independent action. The empire that had once ruled a quarter of the world's population and territory was finished. It had lasted less than 400 years, a brief moment in human history, but the empire's legacy lives on. English became the world's common language. British legal systems still operate in dozens of countries. The Commonwealth maintains connections between former colonies, and the economic networks created by imperial trade still shape global commerce. The British Empire was built on contradictions. It spread democracy while denying self-government. It promoted free trade while maintaining monopolies. It claimed moral authority while practicing exploitation. These contradictions eventually destroyed it. But for nearly 4 centuries, a small island nation convinced the world that it deserved to rule. The sun finally set on the British Empire, but its shadow still covers the globe. The empire is gone, but the world it created remains. The story of the British Empire is the story of human ambition unchecked by human wisdom. It shows what happens when people believe their propaganda about their superiority and destiny. It reveals the terrible cost of treating other human beings as means to an end rather than ends in themselves. Most of all, it proves that no empire lasts forever. The British thought their empire would endure for 1,000 years. It barely lasted 400. Power is temporary. Justice is eternal. And in the end, Justice always wins. The British Empire rose through accident, ambition, and audacity. It fell through arrogance, exhaustion, and the simple truth that no people will accept foreign rule forever. The sun that never set on the British Empire has finally set, and the world is still learning to live in the light of a new day.